Wonderful. Thank you so much, Steffi. And good morning and welcome to this session on sustainable cities. Delighted to be back at DLD. I know I can always rely on my colleague Martin Wolf to cheer everyone up in the room and give you all the positive news about all the world's problems. But this session is very much going to focus on solutions, and we have three great speakers who are all in their different ways in the solutions business. Now, I can tell you as a veteran Financial Times journalist that there are quite a lot of interesting things going on in the world at the moment. There's certainly a bull market in news, and I just want to pick out four of them which I think are relevant to today's discussion. One, as we've been hearing a bit today, at the COP27 climate change conference in Egypt, governments were patting themselves on the back about how much progress they were making, but I think everyone else thought that they are moving too slowly. So one of the questions we want to focus on is to what extent can cities and companies and startups pick up the momentum for change? The second is the war in Ukraine. This is obviously a terrible human tragedy, and it has also forced a massive rethink. Everyone is talking about energy security now, particularly here in Germany, and will that act as a catalyst for change, making us rethink energy? Thirdly, technology. As Azim Azar was talking about yesterday, we are living in an exponential age. We are digitizing and datafying everything. And to what extent can that digital revolution help towards create sustainable cities? And finally, the power of civil society to change the stakes. Greta Thunberg is clearly the most visible face of this movement, but how can active citizens change the agenda as well? And I'm very struck by what has happened in the whole COVID pandemic and how all of us have changed our working practices, and a lot of us are working from home. What impact is that going to have on the way that we interact with cities? So, Victoria, I'd like to start with you. I'd like all of you, if you would, to just talk about that kind of meta theme about whether the locus for change is now at the local city level rather than the national level. And secondly, to tell us about what role is E.ON playing in the energy transition at the city level.
Yeah, I think first, as you said, cities are becoming more and more important. And we heard yesterday from Solveig on these micro-regions. And if you look into GDP and micro-regions, actually cities play a major role and are playing a more and more important role. So unfortunately, from an energy perspective, this also means the concentration of energy you will need in these areas of high GDP in big cities is growing exponentially. If you then look, as you pointed out, into our current situation in the world, where all of us thought gas is a good transition technology towards sustainable cities, now we are learning it might be an interesting transition technology, but probably not so much viable. So this means we're going into electrification of cities, which sounds nice as long as you don't have to do it. If you have to do it, this means we need to have like double, triple the availability of electricity in our cities. Now look at our cities, they are built. I mean, if you look into Europe, Paris, London, Berlin, I mean, these cities, imagine you just triple the infrastructure for electricity there. That's going to be a nightmare. So as an electricity company, E.ON is the biggest grid provider in Europe. So for us, on the one hand, it's a beautiful growth opportunity to build more infrastructure, but on the second, we need to make this possible. And we can't just continue to put copper into the ground. We need to find smart solutions, and this is why we are investing a lot and we are building smart city quarters, because we think the best thing we can do, if we understand electrification means we have a concentration of energy in the cities, we need to reduce the energy we use. We need to share energy. So what we do is we reuse waste energy. Wherever we can, we have a concept on reusing heat, reusing cooling, sharing heat. Data centers share their heat with private buildings. Supermarkets share their excess heat or cooling. So we build a system where we share heat, which accounts for 50% of the energy needs. Then we need to go into a flexible market. This means anybody, and this is why I love this, and this is why I love this discussion around, actually people need to change their behavior because we incentivize them right. One thing is we build the infrastructure, but second is if you want to use energy at the right time, we do peak shaving, which will reduce the need for infrastructure. So everybody who can store energy in their fridge or wherever, in their heating, in their radio, wherever. If we share all that, if we share our batteries of the cars, we will need less energy at peak times. And actually in low energy demand times, we can refuel all of that without building super big hydrogen tanks in the middle of cities. So this is what we do. And I think it's something which all of us need to do as a community. We need tons of startups. We need partnership between citizens, between companies, and between communities.
And when you're doing these smart city quarters, I assume it's a lot easier to build that from new, as it were. How easy is it to repurpose the existing grids for the benefits that you're talking about?
So yeah, please go ahead. Go ahead.
I'll start and then you can continue. I think it's about being smart. There are things where you need to build infrastructure, which is not easy in existing cities. But there are digital things which actually everybody can do. If we have smart meters in all homes, if we can have flexible tariffs, where actually loading during a really cold night with no wind is costing 10 times more than loading during the sun is shining and nobody needs this excess energy. That's going to change a lot. And there you need a really good digital infrastructure, and you need a new view on which digital twins do we have, which data do we want to share. But this is easier compared to putting a lot of copper into London.
Okay, great. Coen, how can the construction industry contribute to getting to carbon neutral future, and what is Edge doing in particular on that front?
So I think that there's some good news and there's some bad news. And let's start that buildings are really bad. And we have a little bit as a theme in our company that the world needs better buildings because they use too much energy, they're unhealthy. We spend 90% of our time in there, and if you come out of them, you're not healthier than when you came in. And there's a lot of mobility questions around real estate. Now, the good news is that today we have the technology to fix that. And so if we now make a new building, we can make that in the operational carbon almost carbon zero, and even in the embodied carbon, so the CO2 that is necessary to build a building, cement, steel, glass, etc., we're already 50% better than 10 years ago, and another 10 years will get us close to zero. So that's great news. The bad news is that, like you said, most of our cities have been built, and most of our cities are full with bad buildings, and it's a huge undertaking to change that. Also there, the technology is available, but it seems that most people that own a house, only when the prices of energy really go up, they have an incentive to start to move things. There's a lot of initiatives at the moment. We have the European Green Deal, we have countries trying all kinds of different things out. And what we are seeing is that, for example, in the Netherlands, if you have an office building and you don't have an energy label C, A, B, C is okay, but D, E, F, as of next year, you're not allowed anymore to rent out that building. And so there will be a huge push for people to start moving. Where does it go wrong? It goes wrong because the governments are not really set up for this change. The bureaucracies already find it super difficult to build enough affordable housing, but to really have a master plan and to think about, okay, we have 1 million homes in Berlin, or what is it, 3 million homes in Berlin, and we need to now change that. They're not set up for that. So the answer to that would be to work together with the industry. But the industry has a really bad reputation. Real estate developers, and maybe also energy companies, we're not seen as the people you want to talk to or you want to do a deal with. And we have to somehow overcome that distrust, build public-private partnerships, basically create carrot and stick and say to the industry, listen, we want you to move on, we want you to make the buildings a lot better, and we're going to punish you if you don't do it, but we're going to give you subsidies if you do. We're going to help you, we're going to make it easier to get permits, to rebuild, etc. And so that whole drive is important, but that discussion between municipalities, between governments, between the European Union and the industry is too slow. It's not really heading in the right direction.
I mean, as you suggest, property developers and sustainability are not often associated in the same sentence, are they? But the image, I guess, would be of property developers ripping down relatively new buildings to redevelop them. Can you talk a bit about whether it's possible to make as much money from refurbishing buildings as from building new ones, and what is the trend in the industry on that front?
Yeah, what we will see in our cities now is that, for example, in the office environment, where also post-COVID a lot has changed, we'll see a lot of empty space, and that gives us a great opportunity to do this refurbishment. I think it will be very difficult to build new stuff, and I think that for us, the work is for 80% going to be the refurbishment of those cities. It's super hard because the structure is there, and very often, you know, if you take, we all know these buildings in Midtown New York with these big cores and we call them donut buildings. Nobody wants to work there anymore in these kinds of buildings, but the owners still have them and need to do something about it. Well, the technology is there, and I think if you have the help of the government and you're allowed to maybe, you know, change something at the envelope of the building, change the way it looks. There's amazing architects out there that can do that for us. Then there's a real path forward. And the next step then would be to connect these different buildings. Some residential buildings only use their energy in the evening, office buildings during the day. We can use that heat, we can use the cool water that is used there, and pump that back and forth. And then, you know, if you do that not on a building level, but on a you know, area level, you can be much more successful. And that's where the technology is already.
Charles, you've written a lot about creative cities as these kind of nexuses of kind of creativity. But during the COVID pandemic, everyone started working from home, and we were all working from home or living at work. How has that changed the dynamics, do you think, of cities? Is this going to be a permanent change, or do you think it was just a temporary phenomenon?
Well, the first thing to note is that the COVID experience, it's probably still around, was the biggest unforced experiment in climate change emissions. You suddenly heard the birds sing and all of this sort of stuff. I know it's all come back again and so on. But it did do a series of things. Obviously, the digital turn, you know, everybody's, you know, on Zoom and variations of that. And what it has done is changed our relationships to place, space, and time. Now, city centres and big cores, you know, the Munichs and all of that, are not going to completely evaporate, but how they unfold and the uses in these buildings may simply change because of hybridized working. And what it's done, it's obviously localized things more to some extent, but not every smaller place benefits. It's those that have some of the qualities of the big hub. And so you do find the geography changing and people's mental geography changing about how they use space and place. So, of course, hybridized working is easy. It's just so much more convenient. It also saves energy often and so on. But clearly, people do like meeting. We do quite like having a chat and so on. So that's not going to go. These are different experiences. Yes, there has been a shift, and crisis is one of the most transformative moments for shifting. I know people talk about let's have a vision, let's have a mission and all of that. That's true. And the crisis, I think, reminded us that the green transition we're talking about is the biggest cultural project of our time. Culture broadly defined in this case, because it's about mindset, behavior, patterns, attitudes, skills, and so on. And here, another dimension that's very seldomly discussed is the psychological dimension, because this transition is a psychological thing. Of course, if you've got a car and all of that, and then you say, oh, let's have an EV car, an electrical vehicle, and all of that. Actually, in reality, it's still going to make cities have lots of traffic jams and so on. But what it also has done, the COVID experience, has actually force-fed the whole micro-mobility movement, because people didn't want to use public transport so much. They're now coming back and so on. So a whole series of things in relation to mobility have changed, and very much this last mile thing. Can I sort of park somewhere here and then perhaps with a micro-mobility come in? So yes, cities roughly look the same. You know, they'll have greening and all of this, and I hope you can signal your wonderful buildings in some aesthetic way, but how they operate will be different.
You've been working with and advising cities all around the world. Could you give us some examples of interesting kind of projects where sustainable projects have been developed?
Well, it also, the interesting point here is, what do we define as sustainability? I mean, Francisca Bria isn't here. She would have talked about Barcelona. And one element of sustainability is giving people agency to act. So many of the things that Barcelona has done are good. Clearly, one of our model cases is Copenhagen, the Nordics, and so on. There's a lot of interesting things happening in Amsterdam with degrowth and, you know, one planet boundary living, donut economy. There's all of that happening. So the leaders often are mentioned to be the same. And as Coen and Victoria have mentioned, the technologies are there. It's can we get our mind round that shift? Easy to say, difficult to do, as we all know.
Yep. Okay. One question I have for all of you is, there used to be a lot of talk a few years ago about smart cities. You could go to every conference and everyone was talking about how everything was going to get digitized in cities, and this would have enormous benefits for the operation of cities, and particularly for environmental benefits. Now, there's been something of a kind of kickback of that movement, as we've seen with kind of sidewalk labs in Toronto and so on. But is that whole idea about datafying everything in cities, is that still valid, do you think? Is that going to be underpinning the sustainable revolution? Victoria?
I think what we learned from a lot of these experiments, that data in itself doesn't solve problems. So you need to be very specific on what you would like to use this data for, and then people might volunteer their data. And if you now look into the energy crisis, and in this perspective, actually the energy crisis is good for us to move forward. If it's expensive enough, as you mentioned, if it's expensive enough, actually people are willing to rethink their behavior. And this is the point where data and digitalization makes sense. So if you say, hey, if we would share availability of energy and availability of energy storage in a city, then we could significantly reduce the energy consumption of a city. If we would be able to share access to electric vehicle loading, this actually would change the number of cars we would have in a city. If we would share heat pumps for the right buildings, if we would take the heat from data centers, this means we need to rethink, and this is not just about building, but a lot about refurbishing and rethinking. And I think this rethinking, the biggest barrier I see for this in Europe is actually regulation, and not so much by the European Commission, but by individual governments who have different views on how private data should be treated, and to even prevent individuals to volunteer their data. For us, we could change so much more, and even in this energy crisis, we could have predicted so much more if we would have had really good disaggregated data from the households to help people save energy and for us to predict which energy is going to be used when. This would have made the crisis easier. And that's something I think where we need to go into discussion. Regulation of data, if there's a good reason to use data and if individuality is still protected, I think we need to go into different direction there.
How is the construction industry using data? And you run a platform, don't you? I think the next platform at Edge. Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, so we found that it was difficult to find enough companies that could do all the data mining out of a building and use that information to make the buildings better. Most buildings in the world use as much energy on a Sunday as they do on a Monday, and I'm talking about office buildings. Doesn't make any sense, and we have to change that. So I think the technology is not the problem. I think that when you look at a city level, the main problem is that the governments, you know, if you look at a city like Berlin, try to get a passport, right? It will take you months before you get a passport. Then you encounter with them and you say, hey, shall we make a city smart? Shall we think about energy streams, connecting different parts of the city together? They look at you like, you know, when we had COVID, the city of Berlin was out because they didn't have laptops, and that took, you know, months. I'm talking about Berlin. There are many cities in the world that have the same problem. Now, the answer could be, let's look at companies and let's ask the companies to do that and solve it. We tried that in Toronto. So Google went to Toronto and said, we're going to have, with sidewalk labs, an amazing new environment. But nobody trusts the real estate developer. And so when they said, we're going to do data mining, we're going to know everything is going to happen, we're going to be very smart about it, and people were looking at it like, yeah, really? You know, can we trust that? And there was such an uprising that Google decided, okay, let's step back and let's not do this anymore. And so this trust is very difficult to solve, I think.
We're running out of time, so I'm going to put a challenge to all three of you on the panel here. What is the one policy change or business initiative that you would advocate, that you think would make the greatest difference to promoting sustainable cities? So Charles, can I start with you?
Well, I think the first thing to note is that overall the global agreements that exist, SDGs, the new urban agenda of UN Habitat, the EU's urban agenda and all of that, have all focused on cities. And the key distinction is that governments have the authority to create the overall rules regime, but cities have the legitimacy to make things happen because they're nearer to the citizen and then can engage them and all of the things and so on. So at a bigger level, and here organizations like the Global Parliament of Mayors are fighting for this, is really a new contract, in quotes, between governments and cities.
Yes.
In Europe, it's not as centralized as in many other countries around the world, but that centralization really is infantilizing cities in all sorts of ways. And so one of the issues there, and it's about power ultimately, is about who has the resources, who controls the resources, who can then, for example, be smart in dealing with public-private partnerships and stuff like that, et cetera, et cetera. Finally, I mean, we run a festival called the Creative Bureaucracy Festival, which precisely tries to address this. It's in Berlin on purpose, and it's been there for 5 years. But what we're trying to deal with this oxymoron is how you rethink the regulations and incentives system to shift power towards, for example, cities.
Great, thank you for that, Charles. Very quickly, Coen, what would you...
Well, I think it's all about taking, you know, all the knowledge that is there into this bureaucracy that needs to do it. If I would be the mayor of Berlin, the mayor of Amsterdam, I would make a technology board. I would take super smart, maybe young people. I would make sure that we can hire those people also and have them. I think that most cities, the bureaucracies have, you know, a population that is not ready anymore to embrace that new technology. So I would bridge that. I would make sure that there would be good representatives of the industries, energy, real estate, etc., and really make sure that everybody behaves and everybody moves in the same direction.
Victoria?
I have a very pragmatic request. Actually, to continue this city journey, we need to have energy in the cities. And this means we need to get power and enough power to the cities. In a lot of countries in Europe, we don't have that because we can't build the power lines fast enough. And in Germany, for example, if you're lucky, you're getting the permission to build a medium voltage power line in 10 years. Sometimes it takes 20 years. We're talking about the cities of the future in 5 years. If we can't speed up the permission process to build these power lines, all of the stuff we discuss is irrelevant because we just don't get the power there.
So we want a new political contract, we want more creative bureaucracy, and we want more technological solutions in a positive way. So we must end it there, but thank you very much to all the members of our panel.